The Wharf has a very interesting history, and today we are fortunate to have Roger Sherman, local historian and descendant of one of Whidbey Island's earliest families, talk to us about the fascinating history of the Coupeville Wharf. Before we begin the interview, here is a brief timeline of the Coupeville Wharf. The activation of Fort Casey in 1901 brought a larger population quickly to central Whidbey. To accommodate the growth, local merchants and farmers built a 500-foot dock extending into Penn Cove at the foot of Northwest Alexander Street. The Coupeville Wharf included an L-shaped building with a waiting room and restroom. It also supplied fuel for the steamboats and served as a passenger ferry terminal, and became an important community center. Elmer Calhoun purchased the wharf in 1909 and added a grain tower to the L-shaped building between 1909 and 1914. The growing popularity of the automobile and the completion of the Deception Pass Bridge in 1936 ended the water transportation era, and the wharf no longer held the importance to the community that it had for the prior 30 years. The 1950s were profitable ones for agriculture, and grass being grown in central Whidbey was processed on the wharf, breathing it new life. But in the 1960s, land transportation continued to improve, and it was more efficient to haul goods off island by truck. The owners of the wharf found it hard to support the deteriorating wharf. The Port of Coupeville purchased the wharf in 1969. Repairs to the wharf were slow but steady as funding became available. In 1985, the wharf was completely refurbished, and a new era for the wharf building began. The Coupeville Wharf is listed on the National Register of Historic Places as a contributing structure. It is part of the Central Whidbey Island Historic District, also known as Eby's Landing National Historic Reserve. Now, Roger Sherman. So one of the questions I want to ask you is, how long have Shermans been living on Whidbey Island? Did your family help build the wharf?
My uncles worked on the wharf, but they were not born when the wharf was built. On my mother's side, the Lacerte side, her family came to Whidbey Island area, Eby's Prairie, in 1885, and my side of the family, the Sherman family, came in 1896. So we aren't pioneers, but we've been here a while.
So another question is, we looked you up and we read that you worked on the wharf, but your uncles helped build it.
Right. Yeah, and not only that, but this, they called it Gillespie Livery, the frame shop now. It used to be owned by the Wharf people, and my uncles worked in there too. One time they brought a barge up on a real high tide to the back door and loaded straw into it. And Elmer Calhoun, who owned the wharf when my uncles were working there, my uncles had limited education. And if we could look underneath the siding that's out there now, I think we could see where Elmer Calhoun taught my uncle Glover how to divide.
Cool. What are your first memories of the wharf as a kid?
Well, Dad, my father used to bring grain down to have it cleaned. They had a screening mill in there at that time. And some of the pictures that you have showed, they called it the dog house. It was actually grain bins that stuck up through the roof. And all the farmers had their grain cleaned here. And the reason for that was they wanted to get all the weed seed and everything out of it so that when they planted it, the field would be clean. And when I was in high school, my father had me bring a truck down to back up on the wharf to have the grain cleaned. Well, it scared me to death because at that time they had a depression that was built into the wharf, so that when you back down that, the truck bed was level with the wharf, and this saved a lot of work because they could use hand trucks to take the sacks off. And so I did it, but when I opened the door, I was looking down at the water. It was that tight. So also, when I was younger than that, I came down a lot and fished. They had a lot of fish underneath the wharf, and they weren't the best, but all of the kids came down to the wharf to fish. That was the thing. That was fun. And you know where the most fish were that we caught? They were in the ladies' restroom. The ladies' restroom and the men's restroom had a hole that went straight down to the water. That would not be permitted today. The restroom? No, that's wrong. They have a regular restroom now that's plumbed into the city sewer.
When you were researching the wharf, what were some of the most interesting things you found out?
Well, I wanted a fairly complete history of the wharf, so I went to the county auditor's office, and they have what's called a microfiche, and of course now everything is saved digitally on the computers. It was a problem because back in those days all of the records were handwritten, and so, and the people had really an excellent hand, but it's just difficult and it takes a lot of time to do that. But I found when the Port of Coupeville bought the wharf in 1969, I found when I can't say his name right now, but bought the wharf in 1949, and all of those records in the courthouse. So it takes a lot of time, but it's just interesting things. Like for instance, there was the person in 1949 was Dick Hansen, and when he bought the wharf, he bought 4,000 feet of tidelands. And when the Port District purchased it from him in 1969, they didn't pay for the wharf. All they bought was the tidelands with the wharf, which I thought was a little weird.
So I wanted to ask you, why weren't all the wharves built in the U-shape is the most practical way of loading and unloading?
Well, in the early days, everything went out on the wharf with horse and wagons, and they had to have a room out there to back those wagons and horses around. It was very, very hazardous. And Elmer Calhoun, when he owned the wharf, it was said that he would grab a hold of the halter, and I guess that's what they call it, and make sure that he had the control of that horse, because backing a four-wheel wagon around in a small enclosed area with horses that did not want to be there in the first place was very, very difficult. And on the island there was, they said that there was a U-shaped wharf here in Coupeville, but I've never found any evidence of that. Toby's Tavern up there, on their menu they have a little bit of history, and they say that there was a U-shaped wharf, but I really don't think there was. Why didn't they make it U-shaped? Cost. Because it would be like building, there's different definitions for wharfs. There's wharfs, docks, piers, and they basically all mean the same. But to me, a pier is the part where you go out to the wharf, to the building, and so in order to build two piers, it would double the cost for that part of the wharf.
How did the original owner get title to the wharf? Was it a land grant?
No, the Oregon Territory land grants started in 1850, which was 55 years prior to the construction of this wharf. And Colonel Isaac Eby was the first donation land claim under that land grant, and I don't remember when. I know they changed it a few years later, but I don't remember when it stopped. But it was probably in the 1860s or 70s, so that was a long time prior to the building of this wharf.
Tell us more about the depression in the wharf that was used for unloading trucks. Why was it located at the end of the dock? And where?
When a truck backed out to be unloaded, in those days they had sacks of grain, and they weighed they were burlap bags, and they weighed between 125 and 150 pounds. It was very physical work. And so before they built the depression in the wharf, they had to unload all of those by hand. Well, then when they built the depression, the truck bed was level with the wharf floor, so they could use hand trucks. In these hand trucks, you could put 6 of those bags on a hand truck, and one person could move them. So it just made made it a lot simpler labor-wise.
Where was it on the wharf? Where did they do this?
Just before you get to the building, it was on the right-hand side, and it was right about, maybe 9 or 10 feet, but it seemed more like 8 feet, right on the edge in towards the middle. Is that okay?
Yeah. Tell us more about why the dock was used as a fuel terminal.
Well, it was the era before large tanker trucks, and I don't remember when they put that fuel terminal in, but it was more efficient to haul fuel onto the island with a barge that was towed by a tugboat than it was to haul it in by trucks, because trucks in those days were small. And I'm guessing that they had a terminal up here with 2 large, maybe more large tanks, because they had different types of fuel. But the barge would come in, and it would tie up to the dock, and then they would pump the fuel up to the tanks, which were up close to where the library is now, where Christopher's is in that area. And the tugboat skippers, Dick Hansen, said that when they came in, tugboats travel 24 hours a day. So he never knew when they were going to come in. It was the same with freight boats. They'd call him up maybe in the middle of the night and say, I'm going to be in an hour. And he'd have to go down and meet him to get everything ready. Back in the old days, they didn't have to follow all of the rules and regulations that they do now. So when Dick Hansen had to replace a piling, usually he got that piling off the beach. And then somewhere or another he would haul it or drag it out onto the wharf, and with a series of pulleys and various things, he would pull it up into the building and then remove some planks and put it down close to where it needed to be. And then he would hook a garden hose onto the bottom of it and leave that running, and the debris that it was sitting on would be washed out, so it would continue to drop, fall down. And it worked beautiful until one night he had a high tide, and he didn't have it secured yet, and it came popping back up. But fortunately he didn't have to do that, because that was very labor intensive. He didn't have to do it that night. Most of the deteriorated pilings were around the edge of the building. And this approach pier was rebuilt in 1885. That was completely rebuilt. Some of the old pilings were used.
Did you say it was rebuilt in 1885?
The approach pier going out to the wharf, that was all rebuilt.
In what year?
1885. Excuse me, 1985.
Do you know how many commercial wharves are there today on the island?
Yes.
Today there's only 3 that I know of. One is at the seaplane base, and they still bring fuel barges in for the Navy. You know, jet planes use an awful lot of fuel, and they bring it into the seaplane base to all field. NAS Whidbey, like they call it nowadays. The other one is Santa Fuca, and it's no longer used. It's owned by Tenco Mussels, but they have no use for it anymore. And this is the third one. All of the other wharves, there was over 20 of them on Whidbey Island. Every little community had a wharf. That was their mode of transportation and the mode that they used to get their farm products and whatever on and off the island. So it's an era that's...
What happened to all the wharves, especially the U-shaped ones?
Well, most of them deteriorated to the place where they couldn't be used anymore, and then I honestly don't know whether they just eventually fell down or whether they were taken down. Like the Robertson's Wharf that was built here in 1885, before this one was built, within 20 years that wasn't usable anymore. They didn't use creosote pilings in those days, and I assume that they used cedar, but they just, you know, if say for instance, if you build a little wharf out here, say just a little model, you know, it's not going to be there in 20 years. It's going to be gone. The weather and the tides and currents are going to take care of that. So when they built this, the company of merchants and farmers that built it, they also bought the Robertson's Wharf, the first deepwater wharf that was built in Coupeville. And I don't know why they did that, whether it was a competitive type thing or not, because it was falling down. And they didn't use it. I think that it was just part of the deal to make the competition go away. The only thing that we have is there was an insurance company that called it Sanford Insurance Company in 1909, and then I think it was in the early 30s. There's 2 drawings, charts, maps that showed both of these wharves, but I think the latter one, it didn't show it.
Okay.
So it had disappeared. And some of those are still standing.
So Alexander donated the land to Robertson then, and that's how he got the title to it?
No, Robertson bought it from Coop.
Bought it from Coop. Okay.
So our last question is, how do you feel about being interviewed about the wharf?
How do I feel about
Being interviewed about the wharf.
Oh, well, that was a tricky question. Well, when you're kind of a historical type, history is my hobby, local history, you feel kind of, well, excited when somebody else is interested in learning that history. And so this type of thing, I feel really good about it because we're recording more of our local history. And so much of it that's recorded is well, not so much, but some of it is just plain wrong. Like, for instance, our history says that Colonel Isaac Eby was beheaded by the Haida Indians from Queen Charlotte Island. Well, he wasn't. We have proved that he was beheaded by the Cake Indians, which isn't too far from Sitka in southeast Alaska. And they have a little village on Coupeville Island over there. So hopefully the history that I've shared today is accurate. I know some of it is because it came out of the auditor's office. But my main interest came from the fact that in 1911, my father was part of a large family. There was 9 brothers, 8 siblings, and he was the eldest. And parents and two sisters and a brother went to Seattle, and Dad was the one that was elected to stay home and take care of his other siblings. And they went on the Clista, and off of West Beach they got in a dense fog, and they were struck by a steel-hulled Japanese freighter, and the Clista sank. In 28 minutes, and there were 75 people on that boat. Everyone survived. And my two aunts, it was the first time that they had left the island. One was 15 years old and the other one was 17 years old. And they had new clothes, new dresses, the whole bit. And when they were in the lifeboat, one of my aunts got her new shoes wet, and she was just having a stroke practically. My new shoes are wet. Well, you know, she could have lost her life really easily. So anyway, that's a story that's been passed down, and I always say that I probably would not be here, because if my grandparents had sunk with that boat, my dad would have ended up taking care of that family, and I'm sure that Mom would not have married him.
Have you seen this book before? See who wrote it?
See that guy there? He looked a little bit different then. Just a little bit.
Can you tell us about your title of captain?
We had in Sea Scouts we had a large enough boat that we carried enough people that we had to have a licensed master on board, Coast Guard, and so I went ahead and got that. So officially, even though my license is expired, I'm still a captain.
Very nice.
Not very many farmers are captains.
I know.
When did you take up doing history? It was after you finished with farming, or?
Well, I dropped out of Sea Scouts in 1995, and that's when I wrote this.
Oh, okay.
And that's when I had more time to, do things like that. And the kids were taking over on the farm, so I was more relaxed. I wasn't under as much pressure.
Yeah. Well, I guess you have seasons when you relax anyway.
Well, yeah.
Sort of.
All seasons now I'm pretty relaxed, but I'm a volunteer. I volunteer for a lot of things, and I'm really busy.
Any more questions, guys?
Congratulations, guys. Great project.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to
Keep up the good work, guys. Okay.